What's good with the YouTube? A Convict's Perspective. It's your boy Flacco coming live and direct and with a little bit of energy this morning. Man, let's get to it. This is part 2 of Upstate Surenos. And what we're going to be discussing is not just how they migrated, but how they've been able to establish small pockets and continue to maintain these hoods up north, right? Now, we previously did in the beginning when we first started this channel, we broke down our different thoughts and views about the Upstate Surenos. We were new to this stuff. We were breaking these things down very simplified. We were just recording these things. So I'm going to go into a little bit more in-depth position of how I feel during my time era. Each one of you may have a different experience with Upstate Surenos. And see, during my time era, we never looked at them as Upstate Surenos. You were either a Sureño or Norteño. This upstate thing is like a new millennium thing that now you see today. Now, I don't know how it gravitated or how they just started to represent it, but I think it has to do with any type of ego and culture, right? You want to be recognized. And I think the upstate Sureño term started because they wanted the recognition that they were up north and that they were on these front lines and that they were out here in war zones, battling for their existence. Now, let's take it back to where I'm from, Santa Clara County. Sanjo. My town in general back then, in the 80s and 90s, we didn't have no Sureños. We didn't have Sureños till about 1990, I think 95 or 96, when a bunch of Sureños from LA moved into a certain apartment complex out there in Milpitas that was focused. They had a program out there in Milpitas to where certain families from out there in Southern California, specifically Los Angeles, were able to get into this program to change their life. And next thing you know, we went from having no Sureños to an apartment complex that had about 20 of them. And it was a straight battle zone. Straight battle zone back then. You know what I mean? Shootings all the time, stabbings. We were rushing each other. They were rushing us. And they actually are the ones that brought my town's gangbanging scene to a whole different level. To where back then it was just fists and stuff like that. These guys started shooting first, as I discussed when my car got shot up out there. And I went back a couple of times and was blasting back, and it was a back and forth thing. And what I tripped was at that time is that they started to align themselves with bices back then and started having working relationships out there with the bices that were in the neighborhood, to which ones we used to be cool with. Next thing you know, these bices were chilling with them. They were supporting them. They were assisting them. And see, because a lot of the bices at that time were the ones that had the pipeline to all the different connects. So whereas we had a cool working relationship, now the bices out there in the communities were starting to turn their cheek on us. And it was kind of weird because my hood traditionally has a lot of the homeboys from my hood where I'm from. A lot of them are originally from Mexico. That Mexican culture, you know, coming from Mexico, their parents not even speaking English, and the kids in the home speaking Spanish primarily as their first language. That's how my hood was. And we never pushed away Mexicanos that were coming over. A lot of them were accepted. They were able to kick in the hood. They were able to represent themselves. And this is how it was. I mean, one of my closest homeboys was a Chilango that came over here when he was about 16, 17 years old. You know what I'm saying? One of the downest homeboys I ever met. So when I was watching Weddle spill the first time, and me and him have had numerous discussions, it's pretty damn accurate from our time era. You know, but in order to understand the upstate Sureños and how they actually migrated out here, you had to have some type of representation from down south for them to even start banging Trece. If you get what I'm saying, you don't just out of nowhere say, okay, we're going to be Sureños, we're going to bang Trece. You had to have someone that was out here in these communities that had migrated from down south to up north. And that's been established for a minute. I mean, there's hoods that are in Sanjo that have traditional roots from down south. Glanton originally has roots from down south. I think Vado Criminale Locals, that started from a Sureño that came from down south. So when we were in juvenile hall on the ranch, we would meet one or two sometimes. And the story that would be behind these Sureños that established these hoods is they were traditionally from down south, whether it be LA, San Diego, whatever different Vados it was from. And what a lot of these Sureños did, they're coming from a high gangbanging environment. The 90s is when it really kicked off out there in the streets, right? Now, so a lot of these hoods migrated from down south, right? Either they established hoods, like you had Vicky's Town, you had Playboys. Those are all traditionally Sureño hoods from down south. you had clovers, you had all kinds of different varietals in different areas that originated from down south. And what they did was is they were able to establish themselves in certain pockets, right? And from there, it was a recruiting basis because a lot of these individuals were already coming from Mexican communities from down south. So when they migrated north, where do you think the first communities that they ended up landing in? Mexican communities, ones that were traditionally of Mexican descent. Paisanos, whatever you want to call it. No disrespect when I use that word bisons, but it is what it is. So you had, like in San Jose, you'd have McLaughlin, right, which is known as Little Mexico. They had their little barrio up there, Barrio Mexicano Locals. Well, it talks about his hood, right there by Newberry's. Storing King's always been known as, you know, the spot to get whatever you need, whether it be green cards, a fake ID, you know, any type of narcotics you want. That was a known spot for bisons to migrate. You know what I mean? It was just a different place, different time era, right? And traditionally, the first hood that started in San Jose that was Surenos was VSL. And they put in a lot of work back then. But you just started to see different barrios that were starting to build themselves up. Like you started to have like Clanton, you know what I mean, which is the same hood as from down south, Clanton 14th Street. But they actually established, like they had West Side Clanton, they had East Side Clanton. But they were basically from the same type of clique from down south is how they migrated. You had VCLs. Like I said before, that was established by some individual named Banda, who was originally from down south. You had VLT, Vario Local 13, which was Polkaway. You had SSP, Sus Santos Pride. You had Vario Champion League Gangsters. All these different Sureño hoods, they started to have these small pockets, and they were in the strongest of the strongest communities that were so much more Mexican influenced than any other areas in San Jose. Therefore, what they were able to do at times was to recruit individuals that were basically of Paisa descent. Like during my time era, yes, there was a few that were raised in San Jose that were born and raised Sureños. Very few, though. Yes, there was some Sureños that moved from LA that were able to establish themselves in these pockets and associate with the Sureños, but very few. I would have to say the majority of the Sureños that were coming over here at this time have the same story as Güeros. I really, truly believe that. But in order for them to have that, they had to have some type of influence or hear things. Okay, the Norteños have enemies of Sureños. They bang 13. So we're going to bang 13. We're going to bang Sur. And the Sureños communities were different back then. You know, actually, they're not different. They were the same. But how they established, they were different than Norteño Vados. Norteño Vados, there was very few that just kicked it basically in one small pocket apartment complex. You had a few hoods that were like that, but the Norteño hoods, based upon school, high school, junior high, they were able to still spread out in one area. They weren't just centralized. And so when you had different Sureño hoods, like Gramercy and Polkaway, these were small, close-knit areas to where if you were a Norteño that was going through those hoods, you had to expect to get off. Because when you used to roll up in there and gangbang, and we used to do this all the time, we used to go through Polkaway. Polkaway was so bad back in the days that they had to block off and turn it into a port because so many homeboys were going through there doing drive-bys that they actually had to stop it. So when you would go up in there, you had to be ready to get off. And anybody would know this, man. I've got off with Polkaway. I've gotten off with Gramercy. I mean, I used to roll up in Gramercy, and I'd have the homeboy Wino from Horseshoe. I'd have him in the back of my trunk. I'd go through there, and I'd dress like a square and act like I'm looking for some mota or something, right? And when the dudes would come out to the car, I'd hit the brakes real hard. Wino would jump out with a crowbar, and I'd have about 3-4 homeboys jump out. That's how gangbanging was. We used to go out there in the streets, go out there down there by Cadillac Drive, you know what I mean? Go do some shootings and then yell at another Sureño's hood. That was gangbanging back then. But see, my mindset and how I look at it is the Sureños nowadays, as you watch because they have their own little rap music and stuff like that. They're out there on social media and stuff. Is now because of how they were able to establish themselves and how these pockets were small. Now people who are being raised in these neighborhoods are becoming Sureños. They're becoming ones that are Sanjo raised, right, in the San Jose area, or Hayward raised, or Atwater raised. They're not the traditional ones that we used to call Bisons back in the days. And see, like you got to understand, like I said before, as Mexicanos that were coming over here at young age, 2 years old, 5 years old, 7 years old, they're coming to a new country. And coming into a new country, you have to understand the fear that exists. It's like if you take yourself out of any environment as a kid, you go to a whole totally new school, you're going to be nervous, anxious, and you're going to try to adapt. And so what was happening in these communities, right, is certain individuals would go in there, and because there was such an established presence that in stigma that the Sureños were mainly bisons, and how some of these people used to dress, right? A lot of them would be victimized or attacked, and it had nothing to do with because they were bisons, but it's because of the neighborhoods that they were moving into, and the clothes that they were wearing. They started to adapt to what they seen in their neighborhoods. They would see, like I was talking to Weddle, and we were talking about the Azteca shirts that they all used to buy from the flea market that had the Virgin Mary, Jesus Christ, and lowriders and all that. And this was something that common that the Sureños used to wear at all times. And then they used to have their little rosaries and stuff like that, you know. And traditionally, they would wear the blue ones for some reason. So individuals would go to school like that. That's how all the Sureños were dressing. So, of course, if you look like a duck, you act like a duck, you know what I mean? You must be a duck. So with the gangbanging mentality, it was take flight, handle your business, ask questions later. And a lot of individuals got pushed away. And so there was also a lot of propaganda going on out there in the streets, you know, amongst these Sureño neighborhoods, you know, like they were promoting and advocating that Norteños didn't like Mexicanos from Mexico. So we have to unite and be Sureños, and we have to bang trece, you know. And what ended up occurring with that, you know, is it allowed these Sureños to start to flourish in these little pockets. Now, don't get it misconstrued. Northern California is always going to be a Norteño stronghold, period. That's never going to change. But it allowed the Sureños to start to establish some type of presence and foothold in certain areas. And so now, like I've said in other spills, people, places, and things are going to dictate your upbringing, how you grew up, what you start banging. So now you have individuals, like I said, that have been here. Their cousins are being sued. Their brothers are being sued. They're born here. They have they've established themselves more with the Chicano culture. But now instead of them being a Norteño that was born and raised in Sajo, now they've become Sureños that were born and raised in Sajo. And this goes with all the areas. This goes with San Fran, you know, Oakland, Santa Rosa, all different areas. This is how the Sureños upstate were able to establish themselves, because once they had these small foothold pockets, that recruiting base was going to continue as more and more people lived in those communities. You weren't going to overtake a neighborhood that already had 30, 40 Sureños. So if you're a young kid that was born, what do you think you're going to gravitate towards? They're going to become Sureños. So there's always been little debates as far as, you know, LA's presence, or did the MA have a presence? And I think that sometimes there's a little bit of truth to that Sureños from down south did have a lot to do with the uprising of upstate Sureños. But that was just a very, very small part. You know, I think individuals coming over here new to a country, you know, at a young age and looking for the acceptance and recognition, that sometimes some Norteños pushed them away, right? That it was easy for the Sureños to accept, especially with them being low in numbers. And what I've always found interesting, right, was most of the Sureños from upstate never understood what representing that trece was. As we all know, being that trece is in tribute and to respect towards the MA, the Mexican mafia members. So you have individuals that are banging sud, that are banging trece, that know nothing about it. And that's the crazy thing about it. That's the manipulation about how these gangs were able to migrate and establish themselves without even knowing what they're representing. And the same thing that occurred with upstate is starting to take fold in other states, with Sureños being established out of state and Norteños. You know, and now it's become a difficult. There's a lot of difficult perspectives in view, as a lot of people want to maintain some type of peace out there in the streets. The gangbanging culture is getting old, but I see a lot of comments. You know, what are they banging sud for upstate? You know what I mean? They should be banging sud down south. They don't belong over here, and I get that, because that would be my mindset. That was as a kid when I was gangbanging. I was like, you could bang sud if you're from down south, but you up north, you shouldn't be banging sud. So that was why my hate for upstate Sureños was always even more than the ones from down south. Because the individuals from down south, we don't have no interactions really on the streets. Unless we were in the pintas and we're getting busy, which occurred all the time. But the upstate ones, we felt that they were invading our territories, our streets. And see, what people don't talk about, the arrival of the upstate Sureños, which in my time frame, like I said before, we didn't call them upstate Sureños. We called them Sureños. We called them a lot of other things, but I'm not going to disrespect them because I'm not that person anymore. But that allowed for the red on red stuff to stop. Because before the existence of the Sureños up north, we would be blasting at each other. And this is one thing that no Norteño wants to talk about. Yes, there's still some red on reds on the streets from time to time since 1997. There's been issues. A lot of times that gets worked out. People get deemed no good or people get their head on right. But without the presence of upstate Sureños, it didn't allow the Norteños to unite and have that same bandera and have that implementation of red on red crime. Because otherwise, who are you going to fight? In the gangbanging culture, you need a common enemy. You need an opposition. If there was no Sureños that were establishing these footholds, this is what no one wants to talk about. Norteños would still be fighting each other. And before the existence of Sureños, Norteños were fighting each other. My controlling case was for a Norteño, for shooting at some Norteños. Every homeboy I met in the 90s, I'd say 8 out of 10 of them that were in for some type of violence and gangbanging activity was against other Norteños. Pre-80s and pre-70s, when there was no Norteños out there, who do you think these barrios were fighting out there on the streets? They were fighting other barrios. LA, what do they do down south? They fight other barrios. So this is one thing that no one wants to talk about. Well, there can't ever be peace. There can't ever be that. Well, until that gangbanging mindset starts to change and be suppressed and everybody goes in a different direction, of course not. Because it's always been a historical figure in the communities to gangbang. This is how it is. If there was no Sureños up here, Norteños would be blasting at each other. That's a fact. The same way that they do down south. If there was no north or south period anymore, barrios would still go at it. That's the gangbanging culture. No one wants to talk about it. The only thing changes is the representation. 14, XIV, or 13. That's the only thing that's changed in 50 years, in over 50 years of gangbanging up north. Because before you have these little pockets and footholds of Sureños that you have, like I said, there's a whole bunch in San Jose. They're out there in the East Bay. They're out there in Sacramento. I mean, all different areas. There's Sureños everywhere. You know what I mean? Is their presence as strong as the Norteños? No, they're not. And that's just me keeping it true. But say if there was no Sureños, what do you think is going to happen out there in the streets? The gangs are going to turn to have fun with other groups because that's just the gangbanging mindset. So when people say, oh man, we can't ever have anything with upstate Sureños, you can't have nothing with anybody until you decide to stop gangbanging, period. And that's the reality. And see, that's the message that I'm trying to sit there and let people know that, man, we don't have to go through this. The gangbanging lifestyle has been played out, man. All you got to do is look at numerous situations. People over and over again are getting hemmed up. And see, nowadays, what people aren't talking about is the Sureños now up north. They now have some type of inmate presence who is running these groups. Sioux Santos Pride was the first hood in San Jose to be indicted in a reference to associating and assisting the Mexican mafia, paying its taxations. That happened a couple of years ago. They just had a lot of their pleas, I think, occurred in 2017. I don't know what year the indictment happened, but I'd have to say 2015 and 2016. I've been told by certain active Sureños, there is an M.A. Garnal that is from Sajo that has control over that territory for the Sureños. So this is how far things have transformed nowadays. And so with all these different working relationships, or I'm not going to say working relationships coexisting, I don't know what the NF and MA's agenda is up at the top. We've been hearing different things, and that they want to focus more on the SNY gangs that are trying to go at actives and maintain some type of foothold, which means that they're trying to be on the same page. Because let's keep it real. Nowadays, there's less actives out there on the streets. There's more individuals that are paying tribute to SNYs out there that are hooking up with these different cliques, and people are falling out left and right. So the numbers are low. So I get the mindset there. But let's stay on this topic of upstate Sureños. So in theory, whatever time area that you're from, right? I've met a lot of Sureños throughout the years from gang banging, from going at it with each other. And like I said, your role just plays on where you're from. You know what I mean? Nowadays, it's if you grow up in a certain area and born and raised, you're gonna adapt to that Sureño lifestyle. The same thing as a Norteño. It's no longer people coming from Mexico and coming into a community and trying to earn their existence and trying to fight for their respect and trying to adapt to a new country. Nowadays, they're state owned, not state owned, excuse me. They're state raised. As far as they're in the states. They're raised in these communities up north, and they're coming in born representing like Sanjo or Hayward or whatever you may be. I mean, no disrespect if anybody feels, but these Sureños are starting to bang the cities that they were born in now, and they're banging Sur. And so I get a lot of people's theories, a lot of Norteños, like I said, that have that mindset, because that would be my mindset if I was still active in the gang banging mix. What the hell are these vatos doing up north banging Sur? You know what I mean? Why? You know what I mean? It all established. They didn't even know what they were banging when they came up here. They didn't even know what Trece was for. They didn't know it was in tribute to the Mexican mafia. They didn't even know the historical backgrounds to it. But now they're already here. And that's neither here nor there. And I just wanted to throw up a couple ideas out there about, the gang banging mindset, man, that regardless if these upstaters would be here or not, which I don't even like to call them upstaters. Because to me, we never call them upstairs. We call them either you were Sureño or Norteño. But if they weren't even up here up north, there would still be gang banging out there on the streets. They'd be fighting each other. So in a lot of senses, we used to say that. I used to talk to other carnales and other bros, and they used to say that, the existence of the Sureños has allowed us to be able to unite and focus on a common enemy to where we have all these hoods under our control. And that's been the NS whole agenda. Just like it's the enemy's whole agenda, is to control their foot soldiers, whether it be the Norteños or the Sureños. So having that common enemy, having that threat, was able to allow the NF to have a stronghold presence to where the Norteños had to unite. You give them a common enemy. You show them who the enemy is. You make them hate that enemy. Therefore, you have the people united under one bandera. And you throw out any type of propaganda that you can to keep everyone in line. To have them under that same, like I said, the same agenda out there in the streets. And when you do that, it all becomes a monetary purpose. And the enemy is doing the same thing with the Sureños up north. You know what I mean? Keep banging that Trece, so as long as they can keep getting more taxation, more territory. They already know that the up north is a NF stronghold, but that they got their presence a little bit up there and they're getting their beaks wet, that goes a long way for them. With that said, man, these are just my views on the upstate Sureños, man. I wanted to come and keep it a little bit different, man, because I think in the first time I did this spiel, I didn't talk about that there was individuals that moved from down south, and that had a lot to do. Yes, they were mostly the recruiting became Paisas, and some Paisas adapted to the Trece because they looked at a common enemy as the Norteños. That is true. But it could have never happened without some type of presence that was coming from down south. Now, were Mexican mafia members sending individuals from certain hoods to set up shop? I don't know. There's always been rumors. As well as there has been a lot of rumors and speculation that a lot of the Sureños that migrated in certain cities that have strongholds like Richmond and, other towns up north had a lot to do with the prisons. So say a certain Sureño or enemy member was doing time in San Quentin in the late 70s and 80s, their families would move up north and, to different communities that were close to these prisons so they can get their visits. And with that, they took their cousins and their families. So there is a theory that some Sureño neighborhoods established that way for the purposes of them moving up to the areas like Folsom and San Quentin was because their family members were doing time so they could be close to do visits. I thought that was an interesting analysis. I got that from someone who does a lot of history and a lot of research. And when he threw that at me, that was something I never considered, But it's something that, I think that everything had a pivotal role in somewhat in them being able to establish themselves. And like I said, they weren't fully established up here. They had pockets and footholds, And they would stay in these pockets and footholds. You wouldn't see them out there on the mainstream, out there in the streets running around. If you did, they were trying to be down low incognito so they wouldn't get got. Because back then, gangbanging was off the hook. It was real treacherous, man. Like I could tell you war stories about so many different shootings, stabbings, and us going into certain communities, and a lot of it was towards other Norteños. But When we get bored, we say, let's go look for some Sureños. Let's go clean house. And so we didn't have Sureños out there in my town. So now we do. So we used to specifically go into areas that we knew that Sureños were at in San Jose. Always on the west side, right? By Keys and all that. Always on McLaughlin. Always on, Pokeway, Gramercy. These are all areas that we used to just go out there every once in a while, man. William Street, looking for Sureños to catch slipping. Whether we had a cuete or whether we had a filero or whether we were just going with bats or just our fists. We would just always try to catch one slipping. And so this enabled them to just, in order for them to survive, they had to have close-knit communities. They couldn't go outside of their communities. They had to have certain courts, certain apartment complexes, and this is where they all lived. And of course, like I said before, youngsters that were growing up in these same apartments, these same streets, they've seen these individuals in their neighborhoods, and they've seen what they were going through, and they've seen what they represented. And of course, that's going to make them to aspire to be the same thing. Anyways, just a real quick spill. I wanted to do a part 2 on this, man. You guys have a good one, man. Stay positive, stay productive. It's your boy Flacco. I'm out.